All right, so my name is Stephen Moe, and I'm a partner at Perryfield Lawyers, and I'm joined today by Chris Morrison. Thanks for joining me, Chris.
That's all right. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're a partner who does a lot in the property team, and one of the first questions that we had from someone was about leases, given COVID-19, and the fact that businesses were definitely not going to be running as per normal. Can you just outline some of the thoughts that business owners need to be thinking about when it comes to their lease arrangements?
Sure. So I guess firstly, starting with your average commercial lease, one of the most common forms that gets used is the Auckland District Law Society Deed of Lease form. And after the Christchurch earthquakes, in the 2012 version of that deed of lease form, there were some provisions added to the lease that dealt with what happens if you are locked out of your premises for a time and not able to use them for the purpose that you leased them for. So that's found in all of the versions of the ADLS deed of lease from that time onwards, 2012. So for a lot of commercial tenants, if they've signed up a lease in the last 8 years, then there's a decent chance that that will be the form that they've used. But if they have been in the lease of their premises since before that, and we have a number of clients who've been in their premises, sometimes for 20 years or longer, they might be on an older version of the ADLS lease. Or if they are in a shopping mall, for example, then it might be a different form of lease. So there's another form of lease called the property council lease, and some shopping malls have their own form of lease that they've created specifically for the shopping mall itself. And so those will have different provisions. But if we talk about the ADLS version of the deed of lease that's existed for the last 8 years.
And Chris, just to interrupt you, the key thing is that people probably need to get a copy of their lease, because like many things, these are things that get put in a drawer somewhere, put in a folder somewhere. But the point is that it's not going to be the same for every single lease. It will vary depending on when it was signed and what form that you used.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you need to have a look at your lease. Maybe it's worth saying at this point in time as well that quite often people get confused when they go and look for their lease, because often when you sign up a lease, especially through an agent, what you initially sign up is an agreement to lease. And then what the agreement to lease says is that you're supposed to subsequently sign a deed of lease. And the deed of lease has a lot of provisions in it that aren't in the agreement to lease, so it's a longer document. But very commonly, people sign up an agreement to lease, start leasing premises, and never sign the full deed of lease. So we've had clients who've heard in some of the news articles in the last week or so about clauses in the ADLS lease that allow them to stop paying rent. And then they've gone and found their agreement to lease and haven't been able to find those clauses in their document. And that's because they're only looking at the agreement to lease, and these clauses are in the full deed of lease. But in that regard, again, with the ADLS agreement to lease form, it actually says in the agreement to lease that even if you haven't signed the full deed of lease yet, all of the provisions of the full deed of lease still apply. So a person might find their agreement to lease and not find anything that seems relevant, but that's not necessarily the end of the story.
Yeah, so that's actually really important though, so that people know, don't get worried if it's not in your agreement to lease. The agreement to lease actually incorporates that deed of lease, which then does have that provision. And maybe just talk us through that, particularly the ADLS one, because it is quite commonly used. And you and I have dealt with some clients in the last week, and that was the form. And these very questions, the reason we're doing this video is that this is exactly what people wanted to know. So maybe just talk us through that clause in particular and why it is that it's so important.
Sure. So in the deed of lease, the Auckland District Law Society deed of lease, there's a clause 27.5 that says, if there is an emergency and the tenant is unable to gain access to the premises to fully conduct the tenant's business from the premises because of reasons of safety of the public or property, or the need to prevent, reduce, or overcome any hazard, harm, or loss, then, and summarising, a fair proportion of the rent and the outgoings shall cease to be payable for the period when you're not able to access the premises to conduct the business. And there's a definition of emergency included in the definitions section of the lease that, again, simplifying, but basically includes epidemics. So where we have a situation like the current one where the government has made a lockdown order because of an epidemic, that does seem to fit within the wording of those provisions in the lease, so that the tenant is entitled to a reduction in rent and outgoings of a fair proportion, depending on how much of the premises they're still able to use. So for some tenants, that might be they can't use any of the premises for any purpose. Some might still, for example, have a server that's running in their premises that they're able to access remotely and continue running their business remotely. So there's some little details like that, but the basic idea is that a fair proportion of the rent and outgoings ceases to be payable by reason of the lockdown.
And the key thing here would be that for someone who has a lease like this gives you the grounds to then have a discussion with the landlord, right? Because it's then about a negotiation about what that fair proportion actually would be.
That's right. And what we're finding is that both tenants and landlords, up until this point, were pretty well unaware that this clause existed.
Mm-hmm.
So in most cases, they haven't really thought much about how it would or could apply. But there are some cases over the years relating to when a fair proportion of rent reduces. Those cases have arisen more in the context of where there's been damage to premises and there's a need for repairs, which means the tenant might have to move out for a while, or maybe they can't use the premises completely while the repairs are going on. And that uses the same language of talking about fair proportion of the rent ceasing to be payable. So there are some cases in that context, and what they seem to say is that the key focus is on what percentage of the square meterage that you have leased, in other words, what percentage of the floor area of the premises are you still able to use for your business purposes?
Well, that's really helpful. Thank you, Chris, because I think this is definitely going to be relevant, particularly in the coming months when we know that things are in lockdown, but even potentially beyond that. So I appreciate your time and your input there. And maybe just to mention that on our website at perryfield.com, we have multiple articles and information which is up, including a summary of everything that we've discussed today. So I'll put a link in this description, and be sure to check out some of those other materials, because we talk about things like force majeure in contracts and stopping supply of goods or services under those, as well as looking at the wage subsidies and how they apply and who they apply to. So thanks again, Chris, for your time today.
Thanks, Stephen.